the surprisingly organized mail service of the Mongol Empire. Hello and welcome. Tonight, I invite you to settle in and let your thoughts drift back to the sweeping plains and mountain passes of the 13th century. This is a story about horses and couriers, about the ambitions of emperors and the simple needs of ordinary people. A story that proves the Mongol Empire was not just built on conquest, but also on remarkable networks of communication. And over the next chapters, we will trace the roads that carried messages across thousands of miles, explore the ingenious systems that kept information flowing, and meet the men and women whose daily labors connected an empire. So close your eyes, if you like, and let us begin our journey. Chapter 1. The Birth of the Yam. Before the Mongol Empire reached the height of its power, the idea of a centralized relay system was little more than a distant dream. In the early 13th century, the world was a patchwork of kingdoms and tribes, each with their own ways of carrying messages. Traders might pass letters from one caravan to the next. Envoys rode for weeks through territories that were often hostile. But in the vision of Temujin, who would become Genghis Khan, these piecemeal solutions were far too slow. If an empire was to span from China to the Black Sea, it would need a lifeline more reliable than any road or army. The concept was simple in principle: a chain of relay stations, called the yam, that would stretch across the land like a living thread. At each station, fresh horses and supplies would await the messengers, allowing them to ride day and night without pause. Though the Mongols are often remembered as conquerors, it was their talent for organization that truly set them apart. When Temujin began uniting the tribes, he made sure that lines of communication were established almost as quickly as the alliances themselves. In the earliest days, the yam consisted of little more than a few tents pitched at intervals of a day's ride. Horses were kept in makeshift corrals, tended by herders who received their orders directly from Mongol commanders. The couriers, sometimes soldiers, sometimes trusted civilians, carried not only official decrees, but also intelligence about roads, weather, and local conditions. Over time, these humble way stations evolved into permanent outposts. Wooden posts marked their locations. Enclosures were built to shelter the animals. Simple huts stored fodder, dried meat, and spare tack. Even in remote areas, a courier arriving late at night could expect a meal, a place to rest, and a fresh mount waiting by dawn. To establish the system, Genghis Khan issued a series of decrees. Each community along the routes was required to contribute resources: horses, fodder, labor. Though some resented these demands, many recognized that a reliable mail service offered security as well as obligation. It allowed the central authorities to respond swiftly to threats. It made tax collection more predictable. It also ensured that distant settlements would not be forgotten. One of the most remarkable features of the yam was its speed. A single messenger could cover up to 200 miles in a day by changing horses at each relay. This was far faster than any European courier system of the time. The Mongols also introduced paisa, bronze or silver tablets inscribed with imperial authority, which allowed couriers to requisition supplies or compel assistance wherever they traveled. So this is a pretty big step. Hoping we could turn to the appearance publishing tablets inscribed with imperial authority, which, in effect, the paisa functioned as an official passport, granting the bearer safe passage and priority treatment. As the system matured, its efficiency began to reshape life across the steppe. Merchants no longer had to risk entire fortunes on rumors. Local governors could receive orders within days rather than months. And, for the Mongol generals, the yam was an extension of their will, binding together garrisons and trade posts in a single, responsive network. Yet it would be wrong to imagine that the yam was simply imposed by decree. It grew out of older traditions of steppe communication, the relay riders used by nomadic tribes for centuries, the custom of hospitality that guaranteed a traveler's shelter, the trust placed in the spoken word. What Genghis Khan did was to scale these customs into an imperial institution. His vision combined practicality with ambition. Then, the Shinjin commanded his men to capture all guests and send them on their way, and if possible, to give them orders by state or simpan. The custom of hospitality, by the time of his death, the yam was already over 10,000 miles long, reaching from the edges of Manchuria to the Caspian Sea. Travelers from other cultures marveled at this achievement. The Venetian merchant Marco Polo, who journeyed through Mongol lands in the late 13th century, would later describe the system in glowing terms. He wrote of the hundreds of relay stations, the thousands of horses, the couriers who rode without fear through lands that might otherwise have been impassable. He noted how a message could travel farther and faster than any army, and how this alone helped keep the vast empire in motion. In the years to come, the yam would only grow in complexity and reach. But its foundation was laid in those first determined efforts. A testament to the Mongols' understanding that power was not only measured in territory, but in connection. And so the relay stations began to dot the landscape, like beads on a cord that linked a continent together. Messengers came and went, their hoofbeats a steady rhythm in a world that was learning to measure itself not just in distances, but in the time it took to share a single word. Chapter 2. The Riders and Their Oaths. If the yam was the body of the Mongol communication system, the riders were its heartbeat. Known simply as relay couriers, they were chosen with care and trained in both speed and discipline. Not every man was suited to this work. It required a stamina that few possessed, an unshakable memory for names and places, and a respect for duty that often placed the needs of the empire above personal comfort or safety. Most couriers began their service as young men. They grew up in the open spaces of the steppe, learning to ride before they could walk steadily. Their earliest lessons were not taught from scrolls, but from the practical knowledge of elders. How to gauge the health of a horse by the way it breathed, how to read the direction of the wind on the grass, how to judge the distance to the next landmark, even when the sky was clouded over. Once accepted into service, each courier received a small kit, a sheepskin cloak to protect against cold and rain, a knife for daily tasks, a pouch of dried curds and millet for sustenance, and, most importantly, the paisa, the official tablet of authority. The paisa was more than a symbol. It was a promise that the empire itself stood behind the bearer. With it, a courier could demand fresh mounts or supplies and expect the cooperation of every station master along the route. Before their first assignment, the couriers swore oaths of loyalty. They pledged to keep the messages they carried secret, to ride with all possible haste, and to accept hardship without complaint. Though these promises were made in the presence of local commanders, many riders took them to heart as personal vows. Breaking faith with the yam was considered a grave offense. Those who abandoned their post or lost important messages could expect severe punishment, sometimes as harsh as exile or execution. But for all the discipline, the life of a courier also held a measure of freedom. On the steppe, there were no walls to hem them in, no crowded avenues to slow their pace. The horizon itself seemed to open, mile after mile, as they passed from one station to the next. Some riders spoke later of feeling most alive when the wind whipped against their faces, when the weight of responsibility balanced perfectly with the exhilaration of speed. The daily routine of a courier varied with the seasons. In the warmer months, the roads were clear and the grasses high. Horses grazed contentedly near the relay posts, and stations bustled with activity. Herders tending animals, cooks preparing meals, scribes recording arrivals and departures. In winter, everything changed. Snow and ice transformed the steppe into a silent expanse. Riders wrapped themselves in layers of fur, their breath crystallizing in the cold air. Yet the messages still had to move. Delays could endanger entire campaigns or cause famine in distant provinces. A single day's ride often covered 40 to 60 miles, depending on the terrain. Each time a courier arrived at a station, he would dismount quickly, hand his paisa to the station master, and exchange a few words about conditions ahead. If the horse had run hard, its flanks steaming, it was led away to rest. The courier took only the time needed to eat, drink, and saddle a fresh mount before setting out again. What many observers found remarkable was the accuracy with which the riders kept to their schedules. Though there were no mechanical clocks, the Mongols developed a precise sense of time based on the sun's position and the natural rhythms of their horses. It was said that an experienced courier could predict his arrival within the space of an hour, even on a journey lasting several days. In larger relay hubs, the station masters maintained ledgers listing the names of every courier, the times they passed through, and any notable events along the road. If a message was especially urgent, such as an imperial decree or news of a military threat, it was marked with special symbols and given the right of passage over all other traffic. These priority dispatches could travel from Karakoram to the western frontiers in little more than a fortnight, an astonishing feat in an era when many kingdoms struggled to move information across even modest distances. The riders' responsibilities did not end with carrying letters. They were also expected to observe and report on local conditions, whether villages were paying tribute, whether bandits were active near the highways, whether harvests looked plentiful or poor. In this way, the couriers became the eyes and ears of the empire. Their reports helped shape decisions at the highest levels, from adjusting tax quotas to planning troop deployments. Despite the dangers, wolves on the steppe, swollen rivers, sudden storms, many couriers served for years without serious incident. The combination of rigorous training, strong community support at each station, and the respect accorded to their role made it one of the most stable institutions under Mongol rule. As the decades passed and the empire expanded, the courier's network grew ever more sophisticated, yet it remained rooted in the same principles: speed, trust, and the conviction that no distance was too great when the future of the realm depended on a single message reaching its destination. And so, in the dim hours before dawn, a rider would slip from his bedroll, tighten his saddle straps, and set out across the cold plains. In his pouch lay scraps of parchment that might change the course of nations, or simply remind a family that a son was coming home. Chapter 3. The paisa, symbol of authority. Among all the tools that kept the yan running smoothly, none carried greater significance than the paisa. A slender tablet, usually crafted of bronze or silver, the paisa was stamped with imperial inscriptions that proclaimed the bearer's right to passage and support. Without it, a courier was simply a man on horseback. With it, he became a representative of the great Khan himself. The idea of issuing tokens of authority was not new. Earlier dynasties had granted seals and tablets to envoys or tax collectors, but the Mongols elevated the practice into a system that bound a sprawling territory together. Genghis Khan, understanding that conquest alone could not sustain an empire, ordered that these tablets be standardized. Each paisa bore markings that were instantly recognizable to station masters, local officials, and even ordinary herders. Some paisa were simple, engraved with a few lines indicating the rank of the holder and the privileges it conveyed. Others were elaborately decorated, inlaid with precious metals and fitted with cords of dyed silk. The highest-ranking messengers carried paisa of gold, a shimmering proof that their mission took precedence over all others. To refuse them aid or delay their passage was to invite swift punishment from the Khan's magistrates. The inscriptions themselves were carefully chosen. They often included blessings for safe travel, affirmations of the Khan's benevolence, and commands to obey the bearer without question. In a society where literacy was not universal, the weight of a paisa was as much symbolic as practical. Its very presence reminded those who saw it that they belonged to an order larger than their own clan or village. Couriers learned early that protecting the paisa was a sacred duty. If one were lost, stolen, or damaged, the consequences were severe. Station masters kept meticulous records of every tablet that passed through their hands, and any discrepancy could spark an investigation. In some cases, the theft of a paisa was treated as treason. Those caught forging or misusing them were executed to set an example. Yet the power of the paisa did not make the system oppressive. In many respects, it brought a measure of predictability to life under Mongol rule. Farmers, herders, and townspeople alike came to expect that when a courier arrived bearing the tablet, they would be compensated fairly for any supplies or assistance provided. This was part of the Khan's larger policy, to blend authority with incentives, so that cooperation became the natural choice. The paisa also helped protect couriers on journeys that crossed multiple cultures and languages. A rider carrying messages from Karakoram might pass through Muslim cities along the Silk Road, Buddhist monasteries in Tibet, or small Slavic settlements near the western borders. At every stop, the tablet served as a silent introduction, bridging differences that otherwise might have led to suspicion or conflict. Historical accounts describe how quickly word could spread about a paisa's arrival. Children would run ahead of a courier to alert the station master, merchants would step aside in crowded markets to clear a path, even warlords who might defy the Khan's tax collectors often thought twice before obstructing an imperial messenger. The paisa did not just open doors, it compelled respect. Over time, the system evolved to include different levels of authority. Restaurants, soft cells, coffee shops opening at supper time. The system evolved to include different levels of authority. Lower-ranking envoys carried paisa that entitled them to basic support. A fresh horse, a meal, perhaps a guide to the next station. Senior messengers enjoyed greater privileges, the right to requisition extra animals, claim lodging in the homes of local administrators, and draw upon supplies reserved for emergencies. The highest rank conferred near unlimited access to resources, reflecting the urgency of their missions. Though many paisa were eventually melted down or lost to history, surviving examples show how varied their inscriptions could be. Some included elaborate seals representing the Khan's family, others bore Mongolian script alongside Chinese characters or Persian phrases, a testament to the multicultural nature of the empire. The tablets were both practical instruments and artifacts of a civilization that refused to be confined by any single tradition. In his book, Discourses on Khan, beyond the couriers, paisa were granted to merchants and diplomats whose journeys served the interests of the Mongols. This practice supported commerce along the Silk Road, ensuring that caravans could move safely between oases and walled cities. Traders with paisa knew they could count on the relay stations for fodder, food, and protection. In this way, the same system that delivered military orders also carried silk, spices, and ideas across thousands of miles. For the couriers themselves, the paisa was more than a tool. It was an emblem of pride. To be entrusted with it was to be recognized for one's skill, reliability, and courage. Even after a rider retired, his paisa might be displayed in the family yurt or passed down as a keepsake. Visitors would look upon it and understand that here was a household that had once carried the voice of the great Khan. In the centuries that followed, other empires tried to imitate the Mongol system. Some succeeded in creating efficient courier networks, but few ever matched the balance of simplicity and authority embodied in the paisa. It remained one of the most distinctive achievements of Mongol administration, a small, unassuming object whose power derived not from its size or decoration, but from the shared understanding that it represented something larger than any individual, the unity of a vast and restless empire. Chapter 4. Relay stations across the steppe. The Mongol couriers could never have maintained their astonishing speed and reach without the network of relay stations that dotted the empire. These stations, known as ortu, were the essential pillars of the yam. Each one provided shelter, provisions, fresh mounts, and up-to-date information about road conditions. They were built at measured intervals so that no courier had to ride more than 30 or 40 miles before relief was at hand. From the moment Genghis Khan first conceived of the yam, the stations were a priority. Commanders and local governors were instructed to allocate land, labor, and resources to construct these waypoints. They varied in scale depending on their location. In remote stretches of steppe, a station might be no more than a timber stable, a yurt for the station master, and a fenced paddock. In prosperous regions near major trade routes, the ortu grew into busy compounds with several buildings, workshops, and granaries. Every station was commanded by an appointed master whose job combined administration, logistics, and diplomacy. The station master maintained ledgers recording every arrival and departure, the health and number of horses, and any unusual events on the roads. These records were periodically collected and sent up the chain of command, forming a system of accountability that reached all the way back to Karakoram. Each station kept a herd of reserve horses, carefully rotated to avoid exhaustion. When a courier arrived, the station master inspected the rider's paisa and ledgers, then assigned a fresh horse and replenished the rider's supplies. If a message was especially urgent, the courier was allowed to rouse the next mount immediately, without delay. The next morning, the visitors was allowed to collect and ride the next mount immediately, without delay. For less pressing deliveries, a short rest was customary, allowing both man and animal to recover. Supplies at the stations were stocked by tribute and taxation. Local farmers and herders delivered grain, meat, felt, and firewood, according to quotas set by the Khan's administrators. In return, they received tax exemptions or payments in silver. Over time, these arrangements fostered a sense of shared responsibility. Communities understood that sustaining the yam meant sustaining the empire itself. During the warm months, the stations were lively places. Herds grazed along the riverbanks, and cooks prepared meals in large cauldrons. Couriers traded news of distant campaigns or markets. Caravans passing through might camp nearby, taking advantage of the protection offered by the station's garrison. Sometimes, however, the guards turned elsewhere, and someone's training in the camp was in danger of going to desert locations. Caravans followed the station's herds for decades. Couriers traded news of distant campaigns or markets. Children fetched water, blacksmiths repaired tack and shoes, and scribes recorded the endless stream of names and destinations. In winter, life at the stations became harsher. Snowdrifts could bury a yurt to its smoke hole, and grazing herds were brought into sheltered enclosures. Still, the couriers came, wrapped in fur and bearing messages sealed in waxed leather. Station masters kept fires burning day and night, knowing that delay could mean disaster. And with nowhere to put it all, an unknown price, nowhere to live the courtesat, station masters kept fires burning day and night, knowing that delay could mean disaster. A station without fuel or food could not serve its purpose, so every detail, down to the smallest stack of dried dung for the hearth, was accounted for. Not all stations were built on the open steppe. In the mountains and deserts, the Mongols adapted their construction to the land. In rocky regions, relay posts were carved into sheltered hollows. In arid zones, wells were dug and cisterns lined with clay to hold precious water. This adaptability was part of the genius of the yam. It never imposed a single model on every landscape, but shaped itself to the terrain. Records from Persian historians describe how carefully the distances between stations were calculated. The intervals reflected not only the endurance of horses, but also the terrain's difficulty and the risk of ambush. In areas where danger was high, such as frontier zones, stations were placed closer together and garrisons strengthened. In this sense, stations were placed closer together and garrisons strengthened. In more settled provinces, the distances stretched longer, reducing the strain on local communities. Even foreign travelers marveled at the efficiency of the relay stations. The Venetian merchant Marco Polo observed that a courier could cover as much as 300 miles in a single day by changing horses at each station. This speed was unmatched in medieval Europe, where muddy roads and political boundaries slowed messengers to a crawl. The relay stations also became centers of informal diplomacy and trade. When envoys from distant lands traveled under Mongol protection, they relied on the same network. At the stations, they met merchants, local nobles, and even curious farmers, eager to hear stories of the wider world. In this way, the yam did more than carry messages. It knitted the vast, diverse empire into a single, interconnected space. Station masters were often among the most respected men in their districts. Their role required trustworthiness, skill, and the ability to balance imperial demands with local realities. To neglect a courier's needs or falsify records was a serious crime. But to keep a station running smoothly was an accomplishment that earned both honor and material reward. Over generations, the relay stations became as familiar to couriers as milestones on a road. Each had its peculiarities: a well whose water never froze, a stable renowned for hardy ponies, a kitchen famous for its salted mutton. These details lent humanity to the system, reminding couriers that while their journeys served the Khan, they were also part of a vast community of people, bound together by duty, endurance, and shared purpose. Chapter 5. Horses of the Steppe, the beating heart of the Yam. If the Paisa symbolized the authority of the messenger, it was the horses themselves that made the Yam possible. Without their unmatched stamina and adaptability, the Mongols' ambitions would have remained confined to the grasslands. In no other civilization of the medieval world was the horse so central to the movement of information, goods, and power. The Mongol pony was not an impressive creature at first glance. Smaller and stockier than the elegant Arabians or European destriers, it stood just over 13 hands tall. Yet behind its modest frame lay a combination of traits that made it the ideal partner for couriers. These horses could survive on coarse pasture, endure brutal weather, and travel vast distances without injury. They had been shaped by centuries of nomadic life, where survival meant finding forage in blizzards and outrunning enemies across endless plains. Every relay station maintained a herd of these hardy ponies. The herds were carefully managed to balance quantity and quality. Too few horses meant delays, too many strained local resources. Station masters kept detailed logs noting each animal's age, health, and endurance. They knew which mares produced the most reliable offspring and which stallions could be trusted to breed stamina into the next generation. Horses were rotated regularly so that none became exhausted. A courier arriving at an ortu would find a fresh mount already saddled and ready, waiting in the paddock or tethered under a lean-to. The exchange was a practiced ritual. The old horse was unsaddled, its sweat rubbed away with handfuls of straw, and it was led off to rest. Meanwhile, the new mount was checked for injuries, fed a last mouthful of oats or dried grass, and then handed to the rider with a nod. In minutes, the courier would be off again, hooves drumming the earth. What set the Mongol system apart was not merely the use of many horses, but the systematic way they were deployed. Each courier traveled with an itinerary specifying how far he would ride before exchanging mounts. The courier knew where to go every time. That meant the distances varied with the urgency of the mission and the terrain. On the open steppe, a fresh horse might be needed every 25 miles. In rugged mountain passes, the same horse might carry the rider twice that distance, carefully picking its way along narrow paths. To keep the system functioning, herds had to be replenished constantly. Local communities contributed animals as part of their obligations to the Khan. In return, they received tax relief or payments in silver ingots or bolts of cloth. The result was a steady supply of fresh horses without resorting to confiscation or force, a system that blended practical necessity with the Mongol genius for incentives. Horses were so essential to the Yam that theft or harm against them was considered a serious crime. A peasant who stole a relay horse might be fined a lifetime's earnings or executed in public to deter others. Even minor negligence, a stable boy who failed to feed or water the animals properly, could draw severe punishment. The reasoning was clear. Every horse was a thread in the web that connected the Khan's will to the farthest corners of the empire. While official records dwell on the logistical aspects of the horses, travelers' accounts capture the emotional bond couriers felt for their mounts. A panicked subordinate might, after days in the saddle, a rider learned the peculiarities of each animal, the way one pony favored its left hoof, the way another flicked its ears when it smelled wolves. When a trusted horse was retired or died, it was often mourned as a comrade rather than a tool. The stations employed farriers who specialized in the care of hooves, fitting iron shoes where terrain required them. Blacksmiths labored at portable forges, fashioning bits and stirrups. Grooms brushed thick winter coats and kept watch for signs of illness. No detail was too small, because a sick or injured horse could derail the most important message. The Mongol saddle was another crucial innovation. Unlike European saddles, which were heavy and built for armored combat, the Mongol design was light, with high pommels front and back. This allowed the rider to rise in the stirrups, reducing fatigue and giving better balance during long gallops. Saddlebags were designed to distribute weight evenly, and a small pouch always held emergency supplies: a ball of dried curds, a strip of salted meat, a flask of fermented mare's milk. The reliance on horses also shaped the very rhythm of communication. A courier could cross hundreds of miles in a few days, but only because horses were treated as precious partners. When a storm descended on the plains, couriers might wait hours, even days, rather than risk a herd's safety. Yet when conditions were right, messages flew across Eurasia with breathtaking speed. Persian historians recorded letters dispatched from Karakorum reaching Tabriz or Baghdad in less than 2 weeks, a feat unmatched until the railways of the 19th century. For all their practicality, horses in the Mongol Empire also carried a cultural significance. They were symbols of freedom and mobility, reminders of a time before empire, when the Mongol tribes roamed without walls or taxes. To the couriers, riding under the Khan's banner was a continuation of that heritage, an expression of identity as much as duty. In peaceful times, relay horses also transported tribute, silk, spices, rare manuscripts, to the capital. When war broke out, they carried urgent intelligence and orders for troop movements. In both roles, they sustained the empire's unity. Without them, no decree, no tax edict, no diplomatic overture could travel farther than the reach of a single man's voice. Even the greatest conquerors depend on humble infrastructure, and in the Mongol Empire, that infrastructure had 4 legs and an iron will. Centuries later, when the Khanates dissolved and roads fell into neglect, the memory of the horses remained. Travelers spoke with awe of the days when a mounted courier could outrun any army, and a message could cross half the known world before a rival even learned it had been sent. In the end, it was not the palaces or armies that left the deepest impression on those who encountered Mongol power. It was the sight of a lone rider galloping across the plains, the paisa flashing on his chest, the fresh relay horse beneath him carrying the future in its stride. Chapter 6. Paisa. The emblem of authority among all the implements that made the Mongol courier system possible, none commanded more respect or fear than the paisa. This simple plaque, usually crafted of bronze or silver, was more than a badge. It was a declaration that the bearer rode with the authority of the Khan himself. Wherever it appeared, gates opened, supplies were handed over, and horses were exchanged without question. The paisa was inscribed with lines of Mongolian script, sometimes inlaid with precious metals. The most common phrase read, "By order of the sovereign," followed by a command that all who encountered the bearer were to assist him without delay. In a society where most people could neither read nor write, the paisa's shape and symbols were instantly recognizable, carrying the weight of imperial power far more swiftly than any parchment decree. There were different ranks of paisa, corresponding to the urgency and significance of the mission. A bronze paisa might be issued to merchants carrying tribute or taxes, granting them the right to pass safely but offering no claim on the fastest horses. A silver paisa denoted an official envoy or courier bearing messages of high importance. The rarest of all, a gold paisa, was reserved for the highest-ranking emissaries, or for those whose missions could determine the fate of provinces. Few dared to ignore such a token. Couriers trained in the yam system were taught to safeguard the paisa as their greatest treasure. Losing it through negligence was punishable by severe penalties, sometimes even death. To forge a paisa or misuse its privileges was considered an affront to the Khan himself. Punishments were swift and public, to remind all subjects that the yam was not merely a convenience, but a matter of imperial survival. Every courier carried the paisa on a cord across the chest or in a special pouch sewn inside the tunic. When arriving at a relay station, he would present it immediately to the station master. A glance at the paisa told the master everything: the rider's authority, the speed required, the resources he was entitled to claim. This clarity was essential in a system where thousands of messages flowed in all directions, and any confusion could bring ruin. Merchants and foreign envoys sometimes received temporary paisa to speed their passage across Mongol lands. These tokens were closely monitored, with expiration dates noted in ledgers kept at the main stations. When a journey was complete, the paisa had to be returned or accounted for in writing. This allowed the yam administrators to track movements and prevent abuses, ensuring that the system remained trustworthy, even in times of turmoil. Marco Polo himself was granted a gold paisa during his travels, an honor that astonished European courts when he later described it. He recounted how entire villages would turn out to greet a paisa bearer, offering food, fresh animals, and shelter, as though hosting the Khan in person. Such deference was not merely custom, it was law, enforced by a shared understanding that the yam existed to serve all corners of the empire, not only the elite. The paisa also served a practical purpose, as a passport through regions where different dialects were spoken. Even if a courier could not communicate with a local official, the paisa spoke for him. The symbols and inscriptions were uniform, and the consequences of ignoring them were severe enough that few dared question their validity. In times of crisis, the paisa could mean the difference between victory and disaster. When Kublai Khan launched his campaigns in China, paisa-bearing couriers carried intelligence on enemy positions, requisition orders for grain and fodder, and urgent messages for field commanders. The ability to traverse thousands of miles with guaranteed assistance allowed the Mongols to maintain coherence across a front that would have overwhelmed any other medieval power. Yet the power of the paisa also created temptations. Some wealthy merchants sought to bribe officials for forged tokens, hoping to gain access to the fast horses and privileged treatment. The Khans responded with vigilance. Inspections were frequent, and the punishment for forgery was always public. Over time, these measures built confidence in the system's integrity, so that when a paisa was produced, even a skeptical station master could trust its authority. Station records from Karakoram reveal how scrupulously paisa issuance was tracked. Each token had a serial mark, and clerks recorded the name of the bearer, the mission's purpose, and the date it was granted. Copies of these records were stored at major administrative centers so that no single official could abuse the process. The Mongols understood that discipline, not intimidation alone, kept the yam functioning. Beyond its official use, the paisa came to symbolize the idea of the Mongol world itself, a single realm stitched together by loyalty, duty, and the unstoppable movement of information. In an age when kingdoms were often closed and suspicious, the sight of a paisa suggested a new kind of order, one that transcended local rivalries in service of something greater. For the couriers who carried them, the paisa was a source of quiet pride. To wear it was to embody a centuries-old tradition of service. Whether riding through mountain passes or across wide river valleys, the bearer knew that behind him lay the will of the Khan, and ahead lay the expectations of an empire that tolerated no weakness in its lines of communication. In time, as Mongol rule receded and successor states emerged, the paisa continued to circulate. Some were repurposed by new rulers, others found their way into treasuries and collections far from the steppe. Even today, a few survive in museums, their worn surfaces bearing witness to a system that once united the largest land empire the world had ever seen. And so, the paisa, simple yet profound, became more than a tool of administration. It was an emblem of what the Mongols valued most: speed, reliability, and the unshakable belief that no distance was too great for the power of a determined rider, a fresh horse, and the will of a ruler determined to bind a continent together. The continent couldn't just halt. It was not just an unchanging mineral slate on the map or a solid place on the Great Lakes map. It was not just a distance the way time did. It was a distance profound. It was not just a physical disorder. It was not just a forest or a mountain. It was not just a distance the way time did. It was not just a distance profound. It was not just a physical disorder. It was not just. The Mongol horse was smaller than the sleek Arabians prized by other empires. Stocky and broad-chested, it thrived in the harsh climates of the steppe. It could survive on sparse forage, endure bitter winters, and maintain steady paces across hundreds of miles. These qualities made the breed uniquely suited to courier work, where speed mattered, but so did resilience. Every relay station in the Yam kept a stable of fresh horses, carefully tended by grooms who knew each animal by sight. These grooms were experts at detecting fatigue. Before a courier arrived, they would prepare a horse already saddled and lightly fed, ready to run the next leg without delay. Such preparations allowed a message to cross entire provinces faster than most armies could march. The couriers themselves were taught to respect the limits of even these hardy creatures. Though Mongol riders were famed for their ability to ride day and night, the Yam required that no horse be pushed past exhaustion. If an animal showed signs of strain, a lagging gait, a tremor in the flanks, it was immediately rested and replaced. This ethic of care was not sentimental. It was a recognition that horses were the lifeblood of the entire communication network. Each horse carried not only the rider, but also a small pack containing essential supplies, dried meat and milk curds, a leather water bag, spare tack, and sometimes a sheaf of additional messages in case an urgent diversion was required. In winter, the grooms outfitted the horses with felt blankets and ensured that icy feed was thawed before consumption. Such attention to detail made the system reliable in every season. Travelers who observed the Yam in action were astonished by the discipline of the stations. Marco Polo wrote that it seemed as though the horses understood their duty as well as the men did. At each post, the arriving courier would swing down, hand over the paisa, and step onto the next horse without pause. Within moments, the hooves were drumming away toward the horizon. The distances between stations varied with terrain. In the broad valleys of Mongolia, a relay might be 40 miles apart, allowing horses to run longer without strain. In mountain regions or deserts, stations were more frequent, sometimes no more than 15 miles apart. This flexibility allowed the Yam to function across climates that defeated many armies and caravans. The visions of Paul Yam Ankainen. The Mongols' skill in breeding and maintaining their horses was not accidental. From childhood, boys learned to ride almost before they could walk. They absorbed an intuitive understanding of pace, balance, and care that no amount of later training could fully replicate. This lifelong bond between rider and horse made the Yam more than a bureaucratic creation. It was an extension of a culture that revered the horse as a partner in every endeavor. Horses were so essential that special officers oversaw their management. Known as horse inspectors, these men traveled from station to station, checking records, examining animals for illness or overwork, and ensuring that no grooms shirked their duties. If a station failed to maintain its quota of fit horses, the penalties could be severe, including fines or removal from office. The importance of healthy horses extended beyond speed. The Mongol system relied on the confidence of those who sent messages. If a noble dispatched a courier bearing critical orders, he had to trust that no delay or mishap would interrupt the journey. The stable's readiness was a silent contract, an assurance that the Khan's roads were always open. In times of war, this network became an extension of the army. Horses reserved for couriers could be requisitioned for scouting or supply missions. This meant that precise horse routes marked out by veterans were second to contraband passengers who saw them as assets for the cause. During the campaigns against the Jin dynasty, entire strings of relay horses were assigned to forward posts to carry intelligence on enemy positions. The same stables that served merchants and officials became arteries of conquest. Yet the Yam horses were never solely tools of war. They also carried tidings of peace, birth announcements, tax receipts, trade permits. In this way, the Mongol horse became a symbol of connection rather than simply conquest. Over time, the sight of a courier galloping across the plain came to mean stability as much as power. The breeds maintained by the Yam were carefully protected from dilution. Foreign traders were sometimes eager to purchase Mongol stock, hoping to improve their own herds. But the Khans forbade such sales except in rare cases, understanding that the strength of the empire rested in part on the stamina of these unassuming creatures. Horses were counted as part of each station's inventory, with ledgers recording births, deaths, and transfers. These records reveal a remarkable consistency. Year after year, most stations maintained enough mounts to sustain continuous operations, even during droughts or epidemics. Such resilience was possible because the Mongols had refined horse management to an art, blending ancient practices with new logistical insights. The couriers themselves developed an almost superstitious respect for their mounts. Before setting out, some riders performed small rituals, tying a strip of cloth around the horse's mane or whispering a short invocation for safe passage. Though official records seldom mention such customs, they persisted in oral tradition. To a rider alone on the steppe, the companionship of a good horse could feel like the difference between life and death. Even the Khans recognized the spiritual bond between horse and rider. Kublai Khan is said to have maintained a personal stable of relay horses, inspected each year in a ceremony that underscored their importance. In these rituals, he affirmed that no matter how vast the empire grew, it rested on the steady gallop of countless hooves. By the time the Mongol Empire reached its greatest extent, the relay horses numbered in the tens of thousands. Their combined strength made it possible to knit together lands from Korea to Hungary, a feat unmatched in medieval history. Today, the legacy of those horses lives on in folklore and legend. In Mongolia, songs still recall the days when a courier could ride from Karakorum to the edge of the Caspian in a matter of weeks, sustained by the courage of his heart and the tireless stride of his horse. Chapter 8: Safe Passage Through a Fractured World. Long before the Mongols began their rise, merchants and envoys traveling between civilizations faced countless dangers. A caravan winding through the deserts of Central Asia or the forests of Eastern Europe had little certainty of safe arrival. Bandits, local warlords, and shifting alliances made every journey a gamble. It was into this unpredictable landscape that the Mongol Yam imposed an unprecedented promise: that roads could be made secure not only for conquerors but for those who carried messages and commerce. Genghis Khan understood that the strength of an empire lay in more than armies. He saw that merchants and diplomats were as vital as soldiers, for they brought wealth and knowledge. To encourage their passage, he issued decrees, guaranteeing protection to any traveler bearing a proper paisa. This pledge transformed the experience of crossing frontiers. What had once been a nerve-wracking ordeal became, if not easy, at least reliably governed by clear rules. Each relay station doubled as a haven. A traveler could expect not only fresh horses, but also shelter, provisions, and a measure of official oversight. If a courier arrived reporting harassment or theft, the station keeper was required to investigate and, if necessary, summon local authorities. In some regions, soldiers were assigned to patrol the routes between stations, deterring would-be robbers. This vigilance had the effect of reshaping perceptions of the Mongol domains. To many foreigners, the empire seemed harsh, but astonishingly well-ordered. The policy of safe passage extended beyond subjects of the Khan. Foreign envoys from distant courts, Persian shahs, European kings, Indian rajas, were granted protection if they bore an accredited letter and the paisa. Aftisa, Bawaja, Jat, and Bhutan were granted protection if they bore an accredited letter and the paisa. Abdullah Sab's policy was to make sure that people didn't resist, which made them more vulnerable to the pressures of safety and to persuasion and protection. Such courtesies were strategic as much as benevolent. They broadcast a message. The Mongol Khans were sovereigns whose power transcended borders and whose roads were open to the world. Merchants were quick to take advantage. As tales spread of secure routes across Asia, new caravans assembled. Silk, spices, porcelain, precious stones, and manuscripts flowed along the arteries of the Yam. In return, the Mongols levied taxes and fees, enriching the imperial treasury. But traders considered the price worthwhile, for no other empire of the time could guarantee that a cargo of rare goods might traverse thousands of miles with such predictability. Safety did not always mean comfort. The relay stations were built for function, not luxury. Travelers might find a simple wooden shelter with a fire pit and a few mats for sleeping. Provisions were often meager: dried meat, millet gruel, fermented mare's milk. Yet even these plain accommodations represented a revolution. In earlier centuries, a merchant caught far from a city might have to camp in the open, vulnerable to attack or exposure. Now, he could count on a roof and official recognition. The concept of secure passage also reshaped diplomacy. Emissaries from distant lands, sometimes rivals or enemies, were treated as honored guests. They received horses, guides, and letters of introduction for each relay station along their route. While local disputes sometimes erupted, any assault on an accredited envoy was considered a grave offense, punishable by severe penalties. This standard, enforced with rigor, created a climate where diplomacy could flourish. It was not only wealth and politics that traveled under Mongol protection. Knowledge, too, passed along these roads. Scholars journeyed from Persia to China, bringing texts on medicine and astronomy. Engineers traveled to Karakoram to share innovations in irrigation and architecture. Even religious envoys moved freely, carrying ideas as potent as any army. The Yam became a conduit not merely of messages, but of cultural transformation. To maintain this fragile safety, the Mongols relied on a blend of fear and incentive. Station keepers who failed to protect travelers risked punishment. In time, conversely, those who distinguished themselves by swiftly resolving disputes or capturing criminals earned commendations. Over time, this balance created a core of administrators who took pride in their work. While some acted out of fear, others came to see themselves as guardians of an unprecedented experiment in connectivity. Among those who benefited most were the caravan masters. These seasoned traders had once paid bribes to every petty ruler along their routes. Under Mongol rule, they carried paisas stamped with imperial authority. Any attempt at extortion could be met with an appeal to the nearest station or, in serious cases, to a regional governor. Though corruption never vanished entirely, the reduction in arbitrary tolls and threats was dramatic. The result was an explosion in trade volume, fueling prosperity from the Mediterranean to the Pacific. Accounts from European travelers often remark on this contrast. Friar Giovanni da Pian del Carpine marveled at how roads that had once been perilous now teemed with caravans. He wrote that a man might ride alone across 100 leagues of steppe without fear of attack, so long as he bore the proper credentials. Though exaggerated, such stories reflected a genuine shift in expectations. The promise of safe passage had symbolic power as well. To Mongol rulers, it was proof of their civilization's superiority. In proclamations sent to foreign courts, the Khans boasted that nowhere else could a man traverse so vast a domain in such security. In their eyes, the Yan was not simply a convenience, but a testament to the Mongol genius for governance. Yet the system depended on constant vigilance. Genghis Khan and his successors issued periodic edicts reminding officials that the privilege of safe conduct must not be abused. They warned that travelers who falsely claimed credentials would be punished as severely as those who obstructed legitimate messengers. This insistence on balanced protection, coupled with accountability, kept the network credible. The legacy of these measures endured long after the Mongol Empire began to fragment. Even in the later decades of the Yuan dynasty, merchants and scholars continued to rely on roads first secured by Genghis Khan's decree. They understood that the Yam had made possible a level of exchange and connection unseen in medieval history. In time, other empires tried to emulate this model. The Ottoman postal roads, the Safavid caravanserai, and even certain European trading leagues drew inspiration, directly or indirectly, from the Mongol experiment. But none matched its combination of scale, efficiency, and sheer audacity. For the travelers who rode those roads, the knowledge that someone watched over their passage was both reassurance and reminder. The Khans claimed dominion over all who crossed their frontiers, and in that claim lay the unspoken promise: so long as you respected the law of the steppes, your journey would be protected. In an age when most rulers struggled to secure even their capitals, this was an achievement nothing short of astonishing. Chapter 9. The Relay Stations at the Edge of the World. In the minds of many, the Mongol heartlands were endless plains beneath a boundless sky. But the Yam did not stop at the steppes. Its roads reached into landscapes where the land itself became a formidable adversary. Arid deserts that swallowed men and animals, icy mountain passes where breath turned to frost, dense forests prowled by wolves. To build a network in such places demanded not only ambition, but a degree of persistence bordering on obsession. Some of the most remote relay stations stood along the Silk Road's harshest stretches. In the Taklamakan Desert, station keepers learned to ration water with monastic discipline. Wells were dug as deep as the tools of the era allowed, and when a well failed, garrisons had to haul water from distant springs in leather bladders strapped to camels. Travelers who reached these outposts often arrived half delirious, their lips cracked, their horses stumbling with thirst. Yet time after time they found relief: a ration of water, a mouthful of dried meat, the promise of another station ahead. Further north, the Altai and Tianshan mountains posed their own challenge. Passes could be blocked by snow for weeks. Station keepers were tasked with maintaining paths through the drifts, using teams of laborers and pack animals. And the first steps in common kind had somehow become stranger and stranger. Passes could be Portuguese or Swiss monarchs, but attempt to cross with mendation paths through the drifts, using teams of laborers and pack animals. Logs were laid to prevent horses from slipping, and shelters were reinforced against avalanches. Despite these efforts, couriers sometimes vanished into the white silence. When spring thawed the passes, search parties would find frozen riders still gripping their peza, as though determined to finish their appointed task. In the forests of Siberia, stations contended with isolation of a different kind. Dense stands of pine and birch muffled sound and swallowed trails. Wolves, drawn by the scent of horses and supplies, prowled around the perimeters at night. Station keepers built high palisades and kept fires burning through the dark hours. Yet, remarkably, the Yam never abandoned these northern routes. They remained vital arteries for furs, messages, and envoys. No less challenging were the marshlands and river deltas of the south. During the rainy season, stations could be surrounded by floodwaters, turning roads to mire. In these regions, the Mongols developed an ingenious adaptation: relay boats. Flat-bottomed vessels waited at the water's edge, ready to carry couriers and their dispatches across submerged plains. Though slower than horse relays, these boats preserved continuity, ensuring that even seasonal floods could not sever the flow of information. The men and women who staffed such far-flung stations became a distinct breed. They were part administrator, part scout, part survivalist. They learned to repair tack and boats, to recognize the signs of approaching storms, to treat injuries and illnesses when no healer was near. Most were appointed from trusted local families, Mongol, Turkic, or Chinese, who knew the land better than any outsider could. But, their days followed a rhythm as exacting as any monastery. At dawn, they fed and watered the horses. They checked supplies, grain bins, water casks, spare saddles. They entered records into the ledgers: who arrived, who departed, what goods were transported. If a courier failed to appear on schedule, the keeper dispatched scouts to search the roads. Even in the quietest hours, someone kept watch. Many accounts describe the strange fellowship that grew among these keepers. Bound by isolation and responsibility, they came to regard one another as kin. When a courier approached, hooves drumming the frozen earth or splashing through the mud, someone would ring a bell or call out, and the station would stir like a living thing. A groom would lead out a fresh horse. A cook would ladle hot broth into a wooden bowl. A clerk would record the paisa number with meticulous care. Then, just as quickly, the station would settle back into stillness, awaiting the next arrival. It was in these frontier posts that the Yam's promise was tested most severely. Anyone could maintain order in a capital city, but to extend it across deserts and tundra demanded a scale of vision that few empires have matched. The Khans understood that no route was expendable. Even the most remote station played a role in the vast machinery of connection. Travelers who reached the edges of the known world often carried with them tales of wonder. They spoke of station keepers who could predict storms by the taste of the air, of horses so swift that a rider could cover 100 miles in a day, of dispatches that passed from one hand to the next across mountains and rivers without ever losing momentum. And to some, these stories sounded like fables, but to the Mongols, they were simply the way the world should work. It was not only practical logistics that bound these stations together. A shared sense of duty animated the entire system. The keepers knew they were part of something greater than their isolated outposts. Each message they helped on its way, whether it carried a royal decree, a merchant's ledger, or a letter from a distant relative, was a thread in the vast tapestry of empire. In this understanding lay a quiet dignity. Among the most remarkable feats was the consistency with which stations operated. Records show that even during wars and rebellions, when garrisons were drawn away to fight, station keepers continued their work. They fed horses, maintained supplies, and awaited couriers, knowing that the stability of the realm depended on their vigilance. With time, the Mongol administration developed protocols for every contingency. If a station was destroyed by flood or fire, its responsibilities were temporarily transferred to neighboring posts. If a route was blocked by warfare, couriers were rerouted along secondary roads. These measures allowed the Yam to adapt without breaking. To many historians, the endurance of these stations remains among the Mongol Empire's most impressive legacies. They were not monuments of stone or wealth, but of discipline and organization. Long after the empire itself fractured, their memory survived in chronicles and in the place names scattered across Asia. Silent witnesses to an age when even the farthest frontiers were tied by invisible lines of trust and duty. As the Mongol conquests receded into history, these outposts were gradually abandoned or absorbed by successor states. Yet their spirit, the conviction that no distance was too great for human ingenuity, lived on. And in the dusty ruins of a remote relay, an old ledger, or the remains of a horse corral, still whisper the story of a system that once defied the world's vastness. Chapter 10. The Couriers, Riders of the Endless Road. If the relay stations were the bones of the Yam, then the couriers were its lifeblood. They were the ones who turned an ambitious idea into reality, crossing the breadth of continents with the urgency of purpose that only the Mongol administration could inspire. These riders, sometimes called arrow messengers, became figures of both admiration and fear, for no terrain or danger could slow their advance. Many were born to the saddle. Young men from the Mongol tribes were trained from childhood to ride at speed, to manage their mounts with a flick of the reins, to draw a bow and strike a target while galloping. This early training prepared them for a life in motion, for days and nights spent in the rhythm of hoofbeats. Turks, Uyghurs, Tatars, who knew the trade routes and the languages of the frontier, but knew not the trade routes and the languages of the frontier. Whoever they were, once inducted into service, they took an oath to carry the Khan's messages without delay or deviation. A courier's equipment was simple but purposeful. Each carried a paisa, engraved with the authority of the Great Khan, granting them the right to requisition fresh horses and supplies. They wore layered garments suited to extremes of heat and cold, with boots stiff enough to endure endless hours in the stirrups. A small saddlebag held dried meat, curd, and sometimes fermented mare's milk for nourishment on the trail. Most crucial of all was the packet they carried, a sealed dispatch case containing letters or records that might alter the fate of armies and cities. The speed of their journeys remains astonishing. Some accounts claim a courier could cover 200 miles in a single day if the route was prepared and horses were waiting. Even more conservative estimates speak of distances no medieval system in Europe could rival. The secret lay in the unbroken chain of stations, where a rider dismounted, passed the dispatch to the next, and watched as a fresh horse carried it on. This relay, performed over and over, allowed messages to outpace any army, any caravan, any rumor. It was not only distance that tested them, weather posed relentless hazards. In the Gobi Desert, couriers braved blinding dust storms that swallowed the road. In the Altai Mountains, snowdrifts rose taller than a man. During the rainy season, rivers burst their banks, turning trails into treacherous currents. Yet the couriers pressed on. Delay was more than a failure of duty. It could be seen as an insult to the Khan's authority. For some, it was said, the fear of that dishonor outweighed any fear of nature. Though they traveled alone most of the time, couriers formed a loose brotherhood bound by shared hardship. When riders met at a relay station, they traded news of distant provinces, shared a meal, sometimes offered a quiet word of encouragement before parting ways again. Some friendships lasted years, their only meetings marked by the passing of a dispatch from one hand to another. The Mongol court took pains to protect its couriers. Any person who interfered with their progress risked severe punishment, including execution. Even powerful nobles were expected to yield their horses if a courier showed his paisa. This universal respect made the riders unassailable in most circumstances. Bandits learned quickly that attacking a yam messenger invited retaliation far beyond any gain. Their skill extended beyond riding. Many couriers were trusted with sensitive negotiations, or entrusted to carry gifts and tribute between courts. A rider might depart from Karakoram bearing royal letters and return months later with tribute from the Song dynasty or intelligence from Persia. They were not only messengers, but envoys, symbols of Mongol reach and prestige. One famous story tells of a courier who rode from the Mongol capital all the way to the gates of Vienna, delivering a letter to the Holy Roman Emperor. The journey spanned mountain ranges and river valleys, crossing territories ruled by many peoples. Yet, the Mongol name opened doors, and the courier returned unscathed, the dispatch case as secure as when he had set out. Such feats seemed almost supernatural to those who heard them, and European chroniclers described the yam in tones of wonder and dread. But life on the road was not romantic. Riders endured privation, isolation, and constant danger. They slept little, ate sparingly, and were always prepared to remount and continue at a moment's notice. Horses were their constant companions, and in many ways their closest allies. A strong, swift mount could mean the difference between life and death in the wilderness. Couriers learned to care for their animals with meticulous devotion, checking hooves, rubbing down coats, whispering reassurance in the dark. Despite hardship, the system worked. Messages that might have taken months by caravan moved in weeks or days. Orders reached generals in time to change the outcome of campaigns. Trade caravans adjusted their routes in response to fresh intelligence. Even ordinary people felt the effects. Local officials could be summoned, tax records demanded, disputes resolved. All because the yam never stopped moving. The Mongols understood the value of this relentless motion. They believed that communication was power, and that no empire could endure without it. The yam was not only a tool of conquest but of administration, weaving together the far-flung lands from the forests of Russia to the plateaus of Tibet. The legacy of these couriers lived on long after the Khanates fragmented. Later dynasties adopted parts of this system, trying to recreate its efficiency. Even European travelers like Marco Polo took note, describing with admiration how swiftly messages could fly across the steppe. To this day, historians marvel at the scope of what the riders achieved. Perhaps the greatest testament to their success is the simple fact that so few messages were lost. In an age before telegraphs and printing presses, when every word was carried by muscle and endurance, the Mongol couriers kept the empire's heart beating. Their journeys remain among the most extraordinary feats of communication ever attempted. And so they rode, day and night, across an empire without equal, never slowing, never turning back. Chapter 11. The Messages That Changed History. Not all dispatches carried by the Yam were ordinary reports. Some messages shaped the course of entire nations. Within the sealed leather packets, words could become weapons or promises, alliances or threats. Over time, these journeys of ink and parchment proved as decisive as any Mongol army. One of the most consequential messages ever sent through the Yam was the summons to surrender. The summons was the summons to surrender. The Khans preferred to offer their enemies a choice: submission and tribute, or resistance and devastation. Couriers carried these demands to distant courts, bearing letters stamped with the imperial seal. When the message arrived, local rulers faced a stark decision. Those who submitted were often allowed to keep their thrones as vassals. Those who defied the summons often watched their cities burn. Chroniclers in Khwaraz recorded how the Shah received such a letter. It was delivered by a Mongol envoy escorted by couriers who had ridden night and day across the deserts. The letter was simple in language, but absolute in tone. When the Shah rashly executed the envoys, Genghis Khan's retribution was swift and total. The fall of Khwaraz became a cautionary tale, repeated wherever Yam riders appeared with the Khan's decree. Other messages, no less urgent, carried intelligence that saved lives. Generals in the field depended on reports from the Yam to know enemy positions and supply routes. Scouts attached to the courier system gathered this information, sometimes at great personal risk. A single dispatch could redirect an army, cut off an enemy's retreat, or force a surrender. The Mongols excelled at this form of communication warfare, turning information into strategic advantage. Yet it was not only matters of conquest that traveled along the Yam. The Khans used the network to maintain their far-flung administration. Tax records, census rolls, and legal petitions flowed constantly from provinces to the capital. A governor in Persia might request grain relief for a famine-stricken district. A military commander in China might ask for reinforcements. These petitions moved with the same urgency as any military command. To keep such traffic organized, the Mongol bureaucracy developed sophisticated protocols. Dispatches were marked with codes indicating their priority. Urgent messages bore special seals that guaranteed the right to fresh horses at every station, no matter how many other riders were waiting. Slower communications, such as trade inventories or scholarly reports, still moved far faster than in other empires, but yielded precedence to matters of war and governance. One remarkable example of this system's power involved the succession crisis following Ogedei Khan's death. News of his passing traveled thousands of miles, reaching Mongol commanders in Europe who had been advancing into Hungary and Poland. Despite being on the verge of further conquest, the generals abruptly withdrew, compelled by tradition to return to the homeland for the Kurultai, the Great Council that would choose a new Khan. In 1760, the Polish conqueror Mongol succeeded in conquering the cities. The Yam made this extraordinary coordination possible. Without it, the empire could have splintered in confusion. While royal and military messages often get the most attention, the Yam also carried humbler correspondence. Traders sent contracts and inventories. Provincial officials submitted local grievances. Even families used the service, provided they could pay the fee or secure a patron's favor. A merchant's letter to his son in Bukhara might travel the same route as an imperial edict, proof that the network served all levels of society, not only the ruling elite. European travelers who witnessed this system were often astounded. Friar Giovanni da Pian del Carpine, one of the earliest papal envoys to the Mongol court, marveled at how dispatches seemed to fly across the land. He noted how a message from the Great Khan could reach a governor in days rather than months. To the Latin world, accustomed to ponderous caravans and erratic messengers, the Yam seemed like sorcery. Its efficiency was no accident. Every element was planned to reduce delay. Horses were bred for stamina and speed. Station keepers tracked arrival and departure times. Couriers logged their routes so administrators could measure performance. Penalties for negligence were severe. A station keeper who failed to provide horses or supplies faced demotion, fines, or even execution if the lapse endangered state business. At the same time, rewards for excellence were substantial. Couriers who completed difficult journeys or delivered critical intelligence could be granted land, treasure, or an audience with the Khan. These incentives created a culture of discipline that endured long after individual rulers passed away. Among the most poignant aspects of the Yam were the messages that never reached their destination. War, weather, or accident sometimes swallowed riders whole. In the archives of later dynasties, historians have found unfinished records, dispatches addressed to governors who had died, letters to cities that no longer existed. These fragments are silent witnesses to the risks every courier accepted when he took up the paisa. The story of the Yam is inseparable from these journeys. Every dispatch was a thread connecting center to periphery, ruler to subject, one life to another. Some threads were woven into the fabric of empire. Others were cut before their time. But all were part of the same design, the belief that an empire could be held together not only by force, but by the steady flow of words. In an age without telegraphs or printing presses, this achievement was nothing short of extraordinary. The Mongols had built a civilization in motion, an empire defined as much by what moved across its roads as by what stood still. And so, day after day, the couriers continued to ride. They carried news of war and peace, of birth and death. They bore messages that changed the fate of nations and letters that mattered only to the people who sent them. Each journey, no matter how small, affirmed the same conviction, that knowledge was power and that power depended on speed. Long after the Khanates fractured, the idea endured. Other empires would borrow, imitate, and admire, but none would match the scale or precision of the Yam in its prime. Chapter 12. The Toll of the Riders Behind. Every swift dispatch and well-fed horse lay human labor. The Yam's scale was made possible by thousands of men and women whose efforts rarely appeared in official chronicles. Station keepers, grooms, cooks, carpenters, and blacksmiths all sustained the couriers and their mounts, often in harsh or isolated places. A relay station, or ortu, was more than a stable. It was a compact settlement built to ensure the Yam's continuity regardless of season or circumstance. Along the steppe, stations were often nothing more than a stockade and a few wooden huts. But in the richer regions of northern China and Central Asia, they grew into small communities. Each had a stock of fresh horses, sometimes dozens, grain and fodder stores, spare tack, and provisions for the riders. Station keepers inherited their appointments, passing them from father to son. They bore the responsibility of maintaining the horses in readiness and ensuring couriers could depart at any hour. Travelers reported that even at midnight, a courier could gallop into a yard and within minutes ride out again on a fresh mount. This readiness did not come easily. Grooms labored day and night to feed, water, and comb the animals. Blacksmiths repaired hooves and shoes worn down by thousands of miles. Seamstresses mended saddles and harness straps. In a single month, a busy station could support hundreds of riders, each expecting the same efficiency. The Yam's demands were so constant that entire families lived in service to it. Children learned to care for horses before they could write their names. Women prepared simple meals, stews of millet and mutton, flatbread, dried cheese, for couriers who arrived half-frozen or exhausted. If a rider was injured, the station was often the first place he received medical attention. Some kept supplies of herbs and poultices, as well as trained healers to treat sprains and fevers. Life along the Yam routes could be perilous. Bandits occasionally attacked remote stations, hoping to seize horses or steal precious dispatches. To guard against such threats, station keepers fortified their dwellings and formed alliances with local communities. They also relied on the fearsome reputation of the Mongol Empire itself. A courier traveling under the Khan's seal inspired caution among potential raiders, who knew retribution would be swift. Weather was the more relentless adversary. Riders faced blizzards in the high passes, sandstorms on the desert tracks, and downpours that turned roads into quagmires. Horses perished in these conditions despite all precautions. Station logs sometimes listed entire herds lost to drought or cold, yet replacements had to be found. The Mongol administration allocated herds specifically to restock the yam, and stewards were dispatched to purchase fresh animals from herders. Couriers themselves endured tremendous hardship. A single journey could cover hundreds of miles, often in isolation. Riders developed methods to stay alert. They chewed dried meat or resin to keep their jaws moving, sang quietly to themselves, or recited prayers. Despite these efforts, exhaustion sometimes claimed them. Travelers found stories of couriers discovered asleep in the saddle, their horses trudging faithfully toward the next station. A few died along the way, overcome by exposure or illness. In exchange for these dangers, couriers enjoyed privileges. They ate and lodged free at any station. They had authority to requisition supplies, horses, or guides when necessary. In emergencies, they could command local inhabitants to assist them, invoking the Khan's name. These powers made them respected figures wherever they appeared, but also caused friction when abused. Regulations sought to prevent extortion or arrogance, with punishments for couriers who misused their authority. Despite the hardships, some men spent their entire working lives in the yam. The prestige of service and the promise of advancement outweighed the perils. Skilled riders might rise to oversee entire segments of the network, becoming administrators with substantial influence. Even the humblest grooms could achieve recognition if they demonstrated exceptional dedication. Among the Mongols, the ideal of loyalty to the Khan was embodied as much in these unseen labors as on the battlefield. One legend told of a courier who, having lost his mount to injury, carried the sealed dispatch the remaining 50 miles on foot. Arriving near death, he presented the message without complaint. Though records do not confirm every detail, the story illustrates the ethos that animated the yam: endurance without hesitation. Over time, the network's demands sometimes strained local communities. The need for fodder, draft animals, and labor could deplete villages, especially in lean years, and complaints reached the imperial court, prompting reforms. In certain periods, administrators introduced schedules that rotated obligations between settlements to ease the burden. Elsewhere, the Khans granted tax exemptions or privileges to communities that maintained stations, recognizing their indispensable role. Yet even these mitigations could not erase the toll entirely. For every rider who sped toward the horizon, there were dozens who remained behind, tending, repairing, preparing. Their contributions were rarely commemorated in marble or ink, but without their vigilance, no dispatch could have crossed the empire. As the centuries passed and the Mongol domains splintered, some stations fell into disuse. Horses wandered free, stockades collapsed into timbers, and paths faded beneath grass. Yet travelers in later generations still found traces, mounds where hearths once glowed, scraps of tack buried in the dirt. These remnants spoke of a system so vast and unrelenting that even time itself could not fully erase its memory. In the end, the yam was not merely a feat of logistics. It was a testament to human tenacity, to the thousands who carried out their duties without acclaim, believing that their labors mattered because they served something greater. Empires rose and fell, but the couriers and their keepers had once bound it all together. Mile by arduous mile. Chapter 13. The Network Beyond the Steppe. While the yam is often associated with the endless grasslands of Mongolia, its roots stretched into many landscapes that looked nothing like the steppe. From the snowbound forests of Siberia to the fertile plains of northern China and the sun-scorched deserts of Persia, the network had to adapt constantly. Each environment brought new challenges and new innovation. In the forests north of the Altai, the relay stations were spaced closer together, since heavy snow could slow travel to a crawl. Couriers here used sturdy ponies bred for deep drifts and bitter cold. In winter, They wrapped themselves in layers of felt and fur until they resembled walking bundles more than men. Firewood was stored in great stacks because every night demanded a blaze to thaw frozen limbs and melt ice for the animals. And every night, ponies helped relay dry spells back to the fire handles in the centuries that preceded the forcible loss of the weather. Horses were stored in dracies, sensing that ponies were frothed and bare to the flesh, and that food would be more dangerous to cook. Fewer and fewer ponies were sold throughout the winter. Every day, more and more people boarded the large fur-clad steamers and collectively made the way to the largest cities, such as Bahrain and Sidon. A journey in this region tested a courier's endurance as severely as any mountain crossing. Farther south, in the Chinese heartlands, the yam stations often resembled small forts, built with clay walls and tiled roofs. This region was crisscrossed by canals and rivers, requiring special arrangements. Ferrymen became part of the network, contracted to shuttle riders and their horses across water. Where rivers were too wide or swift for boats, bridges of wooden planks lashed with hemp rope provided passage. Local craftsmen kept these bridges in repair, knowing a courier might appear at any hour, expecting the route to be clear. In Central Asia, deserts posed different perils. The sand swallowed hoof prints, and dust storms could reduce visibility to a few feet. Here, the yam relied on camel caravans to carry supplies between stations. The animals' endurance was unmatched, but even camels needed water. Wells were dug at intervals, marked by tall poles topped with carved symbols, so travelers could find them across the shifting dunes. To the untrained eye, the desert looked empty, but to a courier, it was threaded with hidden paths and landmarks known by memory. Persia presented yet another complexity. The roads there passed through cities older than the Mongol Empire itself. In these regions, local administrators blended the yam with pre-existing postal traditions. Persian scribes helped copy and seal dispatches, while caravanserai, inns that had sheltered merchants for centuries, were incorporated into the Mongol relay system. Many travelers described the stations here as the finest anywhere: spacious courtyards, cool tiled chambers, and plentiful food. But even in comfort, the couriers moved with the same urgency, for the Khan's business permitted no delays. The uniformity of purpose was what bound the yam together. Whether a rider galloped across a frozen steppe or a warm valley, his duty did not change. Each dispatch bore the same authority, and each station upheld the same expectations. This cohesion impressed foreign observers, who marveled that such a vast diversity of landscapes and peoples could be organized into a single chain. Indeed, the Mongols were remarkably pragmatic in adapting local expertise. They rarely abolished existing practices if they proved useful. In China, they retained the traditional courier bells that announced a rider's approach. In Persia, they relied on Persian engineers to improve roads. In the Russian forests, they sometimes hired local hunters as guides. This flexibility was part of the yam's genius. It imposed a standard where needed, but allowed for regional variations when practical. These adaptations extended to security as well. Banditry posed constant threats, especially in regions troubled by rebellion or political instability. The Mongols addressed this by establishing patrols along dangerous stretches and by granting local officials responsibility for protecting the stations in their districts. If a courier was attacked, the authorities could be held accountable. This arrangement created a shared incentive to keep the roads safe. The success of this integration reflected a deeper Mongol strategy. They saw themselves not merely as conquerors, but as stewards of a connected world. The yam was both a tool of control and a symbol of unity. Every station was a declaration that no corner of the empire lay beyond reach. Messages could flow from the Pacific shores to the Black Sea in a matter of weeks, an astonishing reality in an age without mechanical transport. For the merchants who used these roads, the yam brought unprecedented opportunities. Trade goods once considered rare luxuries, silks, spices, gems, now circulated more freely. A silk bale sent from Hangzhou could be tracked through its journey westward, passed from one station to the next with meticulous record-keeping. Contracts could be enforced across thousands of miles because merchants trusted that their correspondence would arrive intact. Even cultural ideas traveled this way. The designs of Persian tilework, the formulas of Chinese medicine, the teachings of Buddhist monks. The flow was not only east to west. European envoys, such as the Venetian merchant Marco Polo, used the yam to return home with letters and reports. He described stations with awe, recounting how he received fresh mounts and supplies at every stop. His account brought knowledge of the Mongol system to European courts, where rulers began to dream of building their own relay networks. Not all journeys were triumphant. Sometimes a station lay abandoned, emptied by plague or warfare. Sometimes a courier reached a city in flames, the intended recipient already dead. Yet, even then, the yam persisted. Riders turned back to report what they had seen, proving that the system could transmit not only orders, but also warnings and truths, however grim. By the later years of the empire, the yam had become indispensable to administration and commerce alike. No single innovation, no siege engine, no cavalry tactic, had done more to cement Mongol rule. The roads carried more than dispatches. They carried the empire's very identity, mobility, discipline, and the conviction that distance could be conquered by human will. Today, if you trace the old caravan routes across Eurasia, you can still find ruins that once sheltered the riders, half-buried foundations, broken troughs, scraps of iron harness. They are reminders of an age when the vastness of the world was made smaller by the tireless work of those who refused to let it remain divided. So here again, we see the desire for maximum division. Chapter 14. Letters Across Continents. As the yam matured, it began to serve not only the Khans, but also the many peoples who lived under Mongol rule. Diplomats used it to negotiate truces. Merchants relied on it to track shipments. Even scholars and religious leaders discovered that messages could travel across continents with a speed that once seemed impossible. In this way, the postal system became a thread binding together cultures that had long existed in isolation. In the imperial court at Karakorum, scribes maintained careful records of every dispatch sent and received. Messages were copied by hand onto parchment or silk, stamped with seals of office and stored in wooden chests. An archive clerk could trace the path of a letter by examining the records from each relay station. This bureaucracy impressed foreign envoys, who remarked on the precision of Mongol administration. Some of the most extraordinary journeys began in China. When the great Khan sent orders to his governors in Persia, the dispatches passed through hundreds of stations. Couriers carried them by horse to the edge of the Taklamakan Desert, then by camel across the shifting sands. At the western edge of the desert, fresh horses awaited to continue the journey through Samarkand and beyond. What might take an ordinary traveler a year or more could be accomplished in mere weeks. The importance of this system became especially clear during times of crisis. When rebellions broke out, the yam carried urgent reports to the nearest military commanders. Reinforcements were dispatched swiftly because leaders knew exactly where trouble had erupted. In this way, the Mongols maintained order over their immense territories with fewer garrisons than most empires would have needed. Among merchants, the yam inspired a new confidence. A trader in Bukhara could send word to a partner in Beijing, knowing the letter would arrive intact. This reliability encouraged more distant ventures, since contracts could be enforced with evidence sent by courier. Some merchants even arranged for regular reports on market conditions in cities thousands of miles away, adjusting their plans in near real time. But not everyone benefited equally. The privilege of using the yam did not extend to common travelers. For ordinary subjects, the roads remained dangerous, and the relay stations were often closed to those without the proper passes. To be granted a paisa, the tablet of authority that permitted free passage, was an honor reserved for officials, envoys, and favored merchants. The paisa was a powerful symbol, a single object that could open doors, secure supplies, and command respect across the empire. Religious leaders also traveled under the protection of the yam. Buddhist monks journeyed from Tibet to Mongolia, carrying scriptures and gifts. Muslim scholars crossed the steppes to visit Samarkand and Baghdad. Christian emissaries from Europe ventured as far as Karakorum to present letters from the Pope. Each of these travelers described the same experience, the wonder of crossing such vast distances with a certainty of safe lodging and fresh mount. The letters themselves were diverse in purpose and tone. Some were terse military orders demanding tribute or supplies. Others were elaborate diplomatic communications, adorned with flourishes and formal titles. A few were personal, notes of affection, condolences, or gratitude exchanged among families divided by war and conquest. In every case, the Yam treated them with equal care. Among the most remarkable documents carried by Mongol couriers were the letters exchanged between the great Khans and European kings. These missives contained demands for submission or offers of alliance, and they astonished European courts with their directness. To the Mongols, it was unremarkable that a message could travel from Karakorum to Paris. To Europeans, it was almost unimaginable. These long journeys also depended on the skill of the couriers themselves. Riders learned to recognize terrain by subtle signs, the scent of particular grasses, the shape of a distant ridge, the feel of soil beneath the hooves. When storms struck or rivers flooded, they adapted, sometimes detouring for days to reach the next station. The best couriers earned reputations that spread across the empire. Their names appeared in official records as men of exceptional reliability. Occasionally, the system faced near catastrophe. During plague outbreaks, entire routes were suspended, stations were closed and fumigated, and goods were burned to prevent contagion. Yet even then, the Mongols prioritized critical communications. Couriers were dispatched with protective measures, vinegar-soaked cloths over their faces, and were ordered to deliver military and administrative messages despite the danger. With time, the Yam became an institution so respected that later dynasties attempted to imitate it. The Ming emperors of China created their own courier network, though it never achieved the same efficiency. In Persia, the Ilkhanate maintained the Yam well after the Mongol Empire fractured. Even in Russia, where the Mongols were eventually driven out, memories of the system lingered. The greatest testament to the Yam's success was not only that it worked, but that it became part of daily life for those who relied upon it. A merchant waking in Samarkand knew that fresh news might arrive by midday. A governor in Shiraz expected reports from the east before the week was out. The pace of administration, trade, and diplomacy adjusted to this unprecedented flow of information. By the final decades of Mongol rule, many couriers had grown old in the saddle, their lives measured in leagues traveled rather than years. Some retired to tend stations, teaching younger riders the routes and rituals. Others carried on until they could no longer mount a horse. Their stories were rarely recorded in chronicles, but they formed the living backbone of an empire whose true borders were defined by movement. In every letter carried across continents lay the proof of an ambition that reached beyond conquest, the dream of uniting the known world through roads, words, and a shared understanding of purpose. The Yam was more than a postal service. It was an act of faith that even in an age of violence and upheaval, people could be connected by the simple exchange of messages. Chapter 15. The legacy of the Yam, long after the Mongol Empire fractured into separate khanates and distant relatives warred over inheritance, the spirit of the Yam endured. Though roads fell into disrepair and some stations were abandoned to wind and weeds, the memory of what had been achieved lingered in the minds of administrators, travelers, and merchants alike. The Mongols had shown that even in the harshest landscapes, with no iron rails or printed maps, a world could be woven together through discipline and vision. In the heartlands of Central Asia, stories were still told of the old couriers who had ridden day and night across snowfields, deserts, and mountain passes. These were not tales of military conquest or royal intrigue, but of endurance and resolve, of a young man crossing the Altai with news of a governor's death, or of a woman who once tended the horses at a lonely post near the Aral Sea and never let a rider go hungry. Historians later marveled at the scale. By some estimates, the Yam included over 1,400 relay stations stretching across more than 20,000 kilometers of road. At its height, the system employed tens of thousands of horses, handlers, cooks, and scribes. Its costs were vast, yet it was maintained not for luxury, but necessity. Without it, the empire would have collapsed under its own weight. Even as the Golden Horde in the west and the Yuan dynasty in the east drifted apart politically, their use of the Yam continued in parallel. It remained the backbone of tax collection, law enforcement, and supply distribution. It enabled the movement of grain during famine, troops during conflict, and artisans during peacetime. It allowed the Khans to appear all-knowing, even from thousands of miles away. In cities that had once been quiet caravan stops, archives preserved records of the Yam's operation. Lists of station inventories, how many horses, how much barley, how many spare saddles, were kept with care. These bureaucratic traces revealed something essential. The Mongols, often remembered for their military ferocity, had also mastered the art of logistics. They understood that control was not only about conquest, but about connection. The system left a more subtle legacy as well. It changed the expectations of what was possible. In Europe, where feudal roads were often impassable in winter, and messages could take months, the idea of a functioning postal network inspired awe and envy. Marco Polo had written admiringly of the Yam, describing the colored flags, the speed of the horses, and the safety of the routes. His words helped shape Europe's first experiments with royal mail. In Persia, the Yam's routes helped define the Silk Road's final evolution. Markets grew up around the relay stations, inns flourished, and local crafts found buyers from distant lands. Traders knew that behind each hill there might be water, shelter, and news from afar. The geography of trade was redrawn by the rhythm of the courier's hoofbeats. The fall of the Mongol Empire was not sudden, but it was inevitable. The Yam, too, began to fade. As rival khanates fought for supremacy, the careful balance of resources broke down. Some stations were looted, others were neglected until the grass grew tall around the collapsed roofs. The road to China grew longer and harder. Letters were lost or delayed. The certainty of connection weakened. Yet in small ways, it survived. In the Ming Dynasty, a modified courier system based on the Yam principles helped unify the vast Chinese realm. In the Ottoman Empire and in Safavid Persia, royal messengers adopted elements of the system: fresh mounts, official badges, protected routes. Even in Russia, the Yamskoy Prikaz, under the Tsars, borrowed its name and structure directly from Mongol precedent. In the modern world, few outside of scholarly circles remember the Yam by name, but its influence can be felt every time a letter crosses a country, every time a network hums with the movement of information. The idea that distant people can remain in touch through a system of relay, trust, and duty, that began not with electricity or engines, but with saddlebags and wayposts scattered across the steppes. More than anything, the Yam revealed the Mongols' remarkable pragmatism. They ruled not by forcing cultures to change, but by learning how to bridge them. Their couriers did not carry ideology, they carried messages, orders, requests, news, warnings, and praise. Through these, the empire spoke to itself across deserts and rivers, across languages and climates. And for those who lived within it, the Yam was something tangible. It was the sound of hooves in the night, the flicker of a lamp at a distant station, the smell of horses and ink, the knowledge that even in a world of upheaval, there were still paths where one might travel with purpose. So, when later generations studied the Mongols, they found more than conquest. They found evidence of a world ordered not just by might, but by messages. A world where the empire's vastness was not its weakness, but its strength, because it had built roads, stations, and trust where there had once been only silence. And if we listen closely, that message endures, that even the largest empires depend on the quiet work of connection, that the greatest legacy may lie not in monuments or battles, but in the systems we build to carry thoughts across distance, Thank you for spending this time with us, exploring the remarkable story of the Mongol Empire's Yam postal system. Across the wide steppes and through the mountain passes, generations of riders carried more than messages. They carried the lifeblood of an empire that dared to link its many peoples with speed and purpose. In the quiet work of these couriers, we can glimpse a timeless truth, that even the most powerful civilizations depend on simple acts of connection, on the discipline to keep a promise, the courage to travel into the unknown, and the faith that someone, somewhere, is waiting to receive your words. May this story remind us that history is not only made by conquerors and kings, but also by those who pass through the night to deliver news, build trust, and keep distant hearts in touch. Thank you for listening. Until next time, may your own journeys, no matter how fledgling far, find safe roads and welcoming voices at every stop.